William Walter Smith was the curator of Puckakura Park from 1908 to 1920. He was well known throughout the country for his knowledge in the fields of botany, ornithology, and entomology. He is renowned for being the first person to breed kiwi in captivity, and observing their habits, which is the subject of this presentation. The contents are his own words extracted from interviews and letters published in various newspapers.
In July 1908, the late Mr. Newton King gave me a large female kiwi. I prepared a spacious and dark house with soil floor, and a large wired-in, grass yard. A fortnight later I procured 2 more birds, a male and a female. I immediately sank 2 boxes, 2 feet by 2 feet, by 1.5 feet, inverted, without a wooden bottom, in the soil. To the boxes I attached a 4-foot-long passage with wooden sides and top, 8 by 8 inches. On top of the box, or dark recess, we cut a movable 6-inch square door, to enable observations to be taken. The passages to the boxes were buried deep in the floor, with their ends open, and the boxes were left projecting 5 inches. They were placed one side of the 10-foot square soil floor, and afterwards served their purpose perfectly. We removed the temporary box shelters and the kiwis discovered and entered their new quarters on the same evening. The vagaries of the kiwis are remarkable. On the evening the pair arrived I sat silently on a box in the center of their house to observe their habits when they emerged for food. The food consisted of beef, mutton, fish, earthworms, grubs, boiled rice, etc., which we varied much during the years of our experiments. On waking, they shake themselves, and sniff the air vigorously before emerging. Number 1 female appeared first, but instead of walking direct to the food jar, which she had learned to do, she became excited, and scanted rapidly around the house and yard. Returning to the house, she discovered and entered the recess where the 2 new arrivals were located. A great rumpus ensued. I raised the lid and lifted number 2 female out by the bill. The male escaped by the passage, pursued by number 1, hissing, snapping the bill, and striking viciously. They rushed to and fro in the house and yard until they were almost exhausted, but not before the male had received a severe trouncing. Being the middle of August, I secured a second male to mate with number 2 female. They continued to flourish, and soon became reconciled to their enforced captivity. They were supplied with coarse grit, lime, pounded oyster shell, and egg-forming food, to force or induce them to nest and lay eggs. In December of the following year, number 2 pair nested and laid 2 eggs. The first was laid on the 10th, the second on the 18th. They were laid on the soil floor in their dark recess. The last egg laid was slightly smaller than the first. The soil being dry, I sprinkled it with tepid water, and on the following day the male took possession of the nest, and began incubating the eggs. He had become very fat and robust, in which favorable conditions he began his long work. He remained on the eggs until the following night, when he left them to feed, drink, and ramble quickly for nearly an hour about the grass yard. After a good meal of fresh beef, earthworms, and hoo-hoo grubs, he dipped his head in a partly sunken kerosene tin of water, gurgled, ruffled his feathers, stretched his legs, and splashed the water over himself until he was very wet. After a good promenade in the grass yard, he silently entered his house and resumed incubation. When lying on the floor, in the darkness, in the kiwi house, and having the kiwis wandering over me, I began and conducted a series of experiments to test the hearing, scent, sight, and feeding habits of these remarkable birds. I had long been impressed that much remained to be known of their general and nesting habits which could be ascertained approximately by supplying conditions near to those of their forest home. The sexes vary much in size and condition, according to the nature and food supply of the area of bush that they inhabit. When the kiwi attain maturity under favorable conditions, which requires from 2 to 3 years, they are then very muscular and strong birds for their size. They are voracious feeders, and consume much solid food, nightly, when supplied to them. The females being larger and stronger than the males, require more food. Owing to the difficulty in obtaining a sufficient quantity of their natural food, including earthworms, hoo-hoo, and other large beetle grubs, slugs and larvae of the several large and splendid root-feeding species of Porina moths, I continue to feed them on beef, mutton, and the flesh of healthy rats when my dog caught them. They partook freely of liver, and the cleaned and washed intestines of cattle and sheep. All these foods had to be cut in small pieces, swallowable by the kiwis, otherwise they could not have eaten them. The kiwi's sense of scent and hearing are probably more highly developed than in any other known species of bird. When strange birds from their wild haunts were placed in the house, and they had all become reconciled, they sharply recognized each other's sniffing and scenting as they emerged from their dark recesses in the evening. The first bird to begin sniffing generally awoke the others, when they all soon appeared on the floor of their house to feed and drink amicably together. The food vessel and drinking trough were placed on each side of the 10-inch square door giving access to the grass yard. On emerging in the evening they generally ruffled their feathers, stretched their necks and legs, then walked direct to the food dish. It required 2 or 3 nights for some of the birds to acquire a taste for fresh beef and mutton, but they soon afterwards began to consume large quantities of fat and lean of both meats. When hungry they feed rapidly, and produce a large gobbling sound when swallowing their food. They prefer earthworms and hoo-hoo grubs to any other natural food. A healthy female would consume a pint of hoo-hoo grubs every night if procurable. They relished half-boiled rice, and, when placed in a shallow dish of water, they would pick out every seed. They liked hard-boiled eggs and cheese, but would not eat bread, porridge, or potatoes. I occasionally put young birds, lizards, and mice, alive into their food dish, but in no sense did they ever injure one of them. On the highly sensitive bill touching these small living animals, they startled and sniffed aloud, and occasionally kicked savagely at their food dish. On the slightest touch by any moving object, except its mates, the kiwi utters a harsh angry hissing sound, and strikes vigorously with its right foot. When conducting experiments, and observing their habits, I used a dim light with several shades of colored glass, including blue, green, red, and yellow. I used only one color on each night. All the colors used did not seem to affect their eyesight appreciably, or disconcert them in any sense. On the nights devoted to experiments with various foods, I sat on a folded sack in the corner behind the lamp, which cast its dim light over the whole floor, where all the birds could be seen feeding, drinking, and disporting themselves. The drinking trough was 18 inches square by 12 inches deep, and was daily filled with clean water. When drinking, the birds often dipped their heads under the water, and produced a bubbling and gurgling sound. On withdrawing the head from the water, they raised the long bill to an angle of 50 degrees to 65 degrees, and, forcing the water from the mouth and the throat, caused it to run down the neck to wet and wash the body. The process was continued from 5 to 10 times or more, until the body and feathers were well wetted. After a vigorous ruffling of the feathers and shaking of the body, they would go out to the grass yard, and almost immediately attack the wire netting work, to escape and be free. No birds work more determinedly and persistently than the kiwi to gain their freedom. When attacking the wire netting, they frequently paw at it with the right foot, and occasionally endeavor to sap under it. This has to be safeguarded by sinking the wire netting 2 feet deep in the ground. On tiring of attacking and sapping, as explained, they would wander to and fro on a narrow path in the yard for an hour or more, and again renew the attacks on the wire netting. Of the 15 birds that I experimented with, all remained irreconcilable to captivity, and unrelenting in their efforts to escape. Notwithstanding frequent careful handling and fondling the birds of various ages to tame them, they were wholly untamable. The snow-white chicks, only a few days old, used their feet freely, and angrily snapped the soft tender bill when molested. On several occasions I placed a full-grown domestic game cock in the grass yard in the evening to observe his reception, and test the kiwi's eyesight. On entering the yard in the dusk, the kiwi, a large and vicious female, assailed him, and would have killed him, had I not intervened. The kiwi had kicked half the feathers of his back and breast, and had wounded him severely when I stopped the melee. The sparrow hawk is extremely violent when its nest is approached or disturbed, but the kiwi's ferocity and rage, when fighting, quite surpasses it. When 2 kiwis engage in combat, they rush furiously at each other, striking rapidly with the right foot. The impact generally causes both to roll over each time until they are exhausted. The call of the kiwi somewhat resembles that of the weka, but is harsher, and not so loud or far-reaching. While sitting on the floor of their house observing the birds, one or the other would call, for a few seconds, within 3 or 4 feet of me. When calling, the head is held at a slightly upward angle with the bill wide open. The call thus heard so near is raucous and discordant. On hearing a responsive hail from other Kiwis in the bush in Pakakura Park, the caller would listen attentively until the response ceased. During the years that we experimented with Kiwis, we occasionally submitted them to certain tests to enable us to observe and ascertain some of their more obscure habits. We tried their swimming powers. We took them in a boat on dull days, during mild weather, and dropped them gently in the middle of the lake in Pakakura Park. We tried them on both calm and stormy days. Though not such active or rapid swimmers as wekas, Kiwis are good and strong swimmers, alike in rough or smooth waters. On placing the birds in the water, they generally swam in a little circle for a few minutes, and would then swim direct for the shadiest and darkest side of the lake. When propelling themselves through the water, the shoulders and neck are well clear of the surface. Their slower motion is more a walking in the water than a swimming stroke. The birds, being naturally endowed with powerful legs and big feet, should enable them to swim faster than they do. They are quite indifferent to a fast or slower pace when swimming, and are as pugnacious afloat as they are ashore. On being touched on the bill or neck in the water, they would hiss and snap the bill, and strike vigorously with the right foot at the offending object. Occasionally, when kicking, they went under the water, but rose again, each time determined on self-defense. On rising they blow the water taken in from the nostrils, and are indifferent to submersion. They are capable of remaining in the water for an hour or more, without any apparent exhaustion or inconvenience. All such experiments were tried with birds that showed no sign of pairing or nesting, and which were also in robust health. As previously stated, the first egg was laid by the hen of number 2 pair of my captive Kiwis on December 10th, and the second on the 18th. The male alone incubates the eggs. A third, or more, of the eggs during incubation is generally embedded in the soil, which, owing to the heat generated by the bird when on the eggs, becomes very dry. To obviate such, I sprinkled lukewarm water around the eggs to produce a more moist bed to aid in their incubation. When the bird rose from the eggs in the evening to feed, drink, and wash, I waited until it went into the yard, when I shut it out until I examined the eggs, which had to be done noiselessly. Owing to the extremely keen scent of the kiwi, I avoided touching the eggs with bare hands. On placing the bulb and part of the mercurial tube of a good thermometer perpendicularly on the side of both eggs, it recorded on most nights, from 103 to 105 degrees. The heat of the soil for 6 inches around the eggs generally ranged from 82 degrees to 85 degrees. The high temperature is favorable to the bird leaving the nest for several hours every evening without chilling the eggs. To lessen the somewhat offensive smell of the nest, we left the small door open on top of the nest house to admit a free current of air. The incubating bird generally sat at a slight angle on, or across, the eggs. The long bill was rested on the soil and remained for hours in the one position. When incubating, the bird sleeps soundly and wheezes slightly. The great heat generated by the bird, which is required to hatch the abnormally large eggs, is extremely exhausting and renders it miserably thin and emaciated by the time the young kiwis are hatched. We supplied the incubating birds with abundance of natural food, which both adults and young invariably preferred to any artificial food supplied to them. The first egg laid hatched on the night of the 42nd day of incubation, and the second egg hatched sometime during the night of the 43rd day. The latter egg was a sixth smaller in size than the first hatched egg, which yielded a female and a smaller male. I am somewhat impressed that these eggs were incubated and hatched under exceptionally warm conditions, which may have developed them 1 or more days sooner than if hatched naturally in the cooler forest. Although both chicks were apparently normally developed and active, I prevented them from going out into the cooler yard with the mother for the first 3 nights, owing to wet weather. When the male began to incubate the eggs, I shut the female out from the nest house, and provided her with a comfortable box in a dark corner of the house. As soon as the chicks appeared, she resumed motherhood, and continued to rear them with maternal care. The chicks were early astir in the evenings in quest of food, and they occasionally visited the food box on very dull and wet days. They were exceedingly active and soon learned the locality of the shallow box, and to extract the earthworms and grubs from the soil placed therein. In a fortnight they were able to eat fresh mincemeat and fish, and continued to thrive perfectly. Water was placed for them in a shallow tin, but I did not observe them drinking during the first month. The newly hatched chick is pure white, and the delicate bill is light pink, changing to reddish-brown in a month. In 2 months the plumage is pale brown, intermixed with whitish markings. At 4 months the plumage assumes a darker brown, with the shafts of the feathers of a lighter tint. At 6 months it is a uniform brown, with a blackish shade, but not so dark as the mature plumage of adults. For the first 7 or 8 months they were remarkably active and wary, and darted into their house on hearing the slightest unusual sound. When seen feeding, or moving over the floor under the variously colored lights which were used, the snow-white kiwi chicks of the first month are exquisitely beautiful objects. The female continued to be the larger of the two, but at 12 months old was a fifth smaller than either of the 2 mature females in the house. The age of the kiwi may be ascertained approximately by the more or less worn condition of the claws, and the scales of the tarsi. The 2 eggs measured respectively 5.35 and 5.28 inches in length, with a breadth of 3.33 and 3.27 inches. They weighed 15.5 and 13.75 ounces. The eggs also varied somewhat in form. When newly laid, the color is generally creamy white, with slight variations in size in the shell granulations. We kept each pair of birds about 2 years, and again liberated them with their young in their original bush home whence they came, and where their natural food is plentiful. On one occasion, a weasel entered the kiwi house, and killed a young bird, 4 months old.